Parshas Behaalotcha is very, very complex. And I'd like to focus on one of the stories. The Bnei Yisrael complain about the man, the divine food they've been given to eat in the Bamidbar. And they say, Mi achilenu basar, who will give us meat to eat? They want meat. You remember in Mitzrayim we had meat, and now all we have is man. So Moshe Rabbeinu is very upset. He comes to Ribono Shel Olam. He says, why did you give me this burden to tend to such contentious people? How am I going to provide them with meat? And HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives a very surprising answer. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, okay, gather 70 men, 70 Zekanim, 70 elders. According to Chazal, this was the first Beis Din Hagadol. This was the first Supreme Court. And bring them into the Ohel Moed, bring them into the Mishkan, and they will take some of your spirit of prophecy, and transfer it to them. And the 70 became Nevi'im, they became prophets. And as far as the problem with meat, tell the people they should prepare themselves to eat meat, and I'm going to send slav, I'm going to send birds, but they should know that they will eat these birds for up to 30 days, and ultimately will bring about their death. And that in fact was the case, that the slav came, and those who ate it died. And the Ramban is troubled by a question, that what is the idea of appointing these 70 elders to be the Beis Din Hagadol? How did that address the meat problem? It wasn't as if they're going to provide meat, so the HaKadosh Baruch Hu was going to miraculously send slav, so why do you need the 70 elders? The Ramban is troubled by that, we'll discuss that later. Now the problem is, how do you apportion 70 elders among 12 tribes? Doesn't work. So it says in the pasuk there were two people that were extra, and that's because if each of the 12 tribes gives 6 people, so 6 times 12 is 72. So you'd have to have 2 shvatim that would hold back one candidate. So there were 2 that should not have gone. Instead, the way Chazal explained it, those 2 did join the 70, and 2 who really should have joined did not go. And they went into Eldad and Medad. And since they were meant to be members of that Beis Din, they did become prophets as well. And there's a subplot in the story. And in this subplot, the message is brought to Moshe Rabbeinu that Eldad and Medad misnabim b'machana. That Eldad and Medad are prophesying in the camp. They should have joined the rest of the 70 in the Ohel Moed, but their places were taken by 2 that shouldn't have been there, and accordingly they didn't go, and they were prophesying in the middle of the camp. So it says that Yoshua, who was Moshe Rabbeinu's assistant, attendant, said, Moshe, Adoni Moshe, Master Moshe, Kloim, imprison them. In other words, put them in jail for this terrible offense of prophesying. So, what was so bad? What were they prophesying? So the Gemara in Sanhedrin says, Rashi quotes, they were prophesying Moshe Meis v'Yoshua Machnes es Yisrael, that Moshe Rabbeinu was going to die, and Yoshua is going to lead the Jews into Eretz Yisrael. And this is why undoubtedly Yoshua is so indignant, because this was a prophecy that his Rebbe Moshe was going to die. So Moshe Rabbeinu responds in a manner which is not surprising given his humility, and he said to Yoshua, Hamakanei atoli, are you being zealous on my behalf? Umiyitain kol am Hashem neviim, halavai, the entire Jewish nation should become prophets. And then the Torah gets back on track with the story. The slav comes, and the eaters of the slav die, And the place is called Kivros HaTa'ava, the graves of desire, because this is where the people who had the desire for meat were buried. That's the basic story. Now, the first question we already mentioned, that what is the idea of the appointment of these 70 Zkanim, and how is that going to address the meat problem? Let's put that question on the back burner. But the prophecy of El Meidad is particularly troubling. Now, we know that Moshe Rabbeinu did not go into Eretz Yisrael, and Yeshua ultimately did lead the Jews. But this is a consequence of events that occurred much later in history. At the end of the 40 years, Moshe Rabbeinu was told to speak to the rock and bring forth water. And something happened at that place. There are various opinions as to what the sin was. According to Rashi, instead of speaking to the rock, he hit the rock. There are other interpretations, but something happened there. And because of that, Moshe Rabbeinu lost his right to go into Eretz Yisrael. It was 38 years later that Moshe Rabbeinu lost his right to go into Eretz Yisrael. What is the idea of El Meidad having such a prophecy now? Because what is the connection between the events of the desire for meat and the appointment of the Beis Din, that the El Meidad should have this prophecy, which foretells a determination which is not yet made and is going to be based on something that's going to occur decades later? There's another interesting thing about this prophecy of El Meidad. And the Netziv, in the beginning of Parsha Shlach, says an amazing thing in his commentary, a very, very, very puzzling thing. Is we have a cloud, we have a rule, that one of the ways that a prophet establishes himself as a prophet is by making a prediction of the future. A super accurate prediction of the future. If the prediction comes true, you know that he's a Navi Emes, a true prophet. If it doesn't come true, you know that he's a Navi Sheker, he's a false Sheker, false prophet, and he's liable for the death penalty. That test only makes sense if we assume that a prophecy has no strings attached. There are no hidden conditions. But let's say, for example, the Navi foretells that X will happen, and it doesn't happen. And we say, look, you appear to be a false prophet. And then the Navi says, no, it was supposed to happen. But there was an understood condition, the condition wasn't met, so I'm not really a false prophet. So the test goes down the drain. How do you confirm that a Navi is a Navi Emes, or demonstrate that he's a Navi Sheker, if there always can be a hidden condition? So obviously it's understood that when a Navi receives a prophecy, if the prophecy makes no mention of a condition, it is understood to be a prophecy without any conditions. And if it doesn't come true, the Navi is shown to be a Navi Sheker. The Rambam proves, the Rambam in the Hakdamah to the Parasha Mishnah, that there is a distinction between a good prophecy and a bad prophecy. Meaning, if God tells the prophet something good will happen, then we say it's an absolute unconditional promise unless the condition has been specified. And therefore, if it doesn't come true, that is the test that the Navi is a false Navi. But if it's a bad prophecy, if God tells the Navi that some calamity will happen, so then, if it doesn't happen, it doesn't prove anything. Why? Because bad things happen as a consequence of sin. If you do tshuva, if you repent, then obviously the calamity isn't going to happen. So every prophecy that foretells a bad thing is understood as having been given on a condition, and therefore the Navi can always say, if it didn't come true, the condition wasn't met. The people repented, and that's why the prophecy didn't come true. This is what the Rambam says. So the Netziv points out an amazing thing about this prophecy of El Meidad. He says like this: there really are two halves. Moshe Mace, that Moshe Rabbeinu is going to die in the Midbar. He's not going to go into Eretz Yisrael. That's a prophecy of calamity, prophecy of doom. And then the second half is Yeshua Machnes. The Yeshua is going to ascend to a position of great leadership, and he's going to lead the Jews into Eretz Yisrael. That's a good prophecy. So the Netziv says like this, that Moshe Rabbeinu was aware of this prophecy. And therefore later on, when he is told by God that you're not going to go into Eretz Yisrael, and Moshe Rabbeinu davens and he prays that the Gzer be annulled, he says, you never find that Moshe Rabbeinu prayed that he should be the leader of the Jewish people. He only prayed that he should go into Eretz Yisrael. Says why? Says the Netziv, because the prophecy that Yoshua Machnes, since that was a nevuah for good, that couldn't be canceled. It had to be fulfilled, because a nevuah for good is always presumed to be unconditional. And therefore, Yeshua was going to be the leader no matter what. So Moshe couldn't pray that he should have the privilege of leading the Jewish people. Moshe knew that it would be Yeshua who would lead the Jews into Eretz Yisrael. But Moshe Rabbeinu thought that he could be the leader emeritus. In other words, he would go into Eretz Yisrael as a commoner, not as a leader. Because the nevuah of Moshe Meis, that's a nevuah lirah, that's a nevuah of calamity. And that could be annulled through prayer, through repentance. And this is the amazing thing. That's why Moshe Rabbeinu never davens that he should be the leader of the Jewish people. He only prays he should not to go into Eretz Yisrael. But Moshe understood that Yeshua would have to be the leader. So says the Netziv. Now this is a very puzzling thing, because the Chumash says the exact opposite. The Chumash says in Parshas Pinchas that when Moshe Rabbeinu finally understood that his prayers would not be accepted, he asks HaKadosh Baruch Hu to appoint a leader. Appoint Ish al Ha'eda, appoint a person who will lead the people, who will understand them. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Moshe Rabbeinu that your assistant Yoshua is the one. What is Moshe Rabbeinu davening for? There was already a prophecy that Eldad and Medad said that Moshe was going to die and Yeshua was going to be his replacement. So what is Moshe Rabbeinu davening? And Bifrat, if we go with the Midrashim that Rashi quotes, Rashi says that when Moshe Rabbeinu asked the Kadosh Baruch Hu to appoint a leader, Moshe Rabbeinu had a hidden agenda. Moshe Rabbeinu really intended that his children should be appointed in his place. Now Kadosh Baruch Hu told him, no, not like you thought, that it'll be your children. Instead it'll be your student, Yoshua. But Moshe Rabbeinu thought it would be his children. There was a prophecy. There was a prophecy of Eldad Umeidad that Moshe Meis v'Yoshua Machnas is Yisrael, that Moshe would die and Yoshua would lead the Jews into Eretz Yisrael. How is it possible that Moshe Rabbeinu could have thought otherwise? And he has to ask the Kadosh Baruch Hu to appoint a replacement. It was already established, already determined. He knew that. Okay, let's put all those questions in the back burner. There's another basic question. The Shalach HaKadosh deals with this question, which is, what is the connection of this prophecy of Eldad Umeidad to the story? The Jews want to meet, they complain about the Mon, there's a Sanhedrin appointed, and all of a sudden Eldad Umeidad have this prophecy. What is the connection of this prophecy to the context of the entire story? Okay, to address all these questions, I'd like to share with you three classic divrei Torah that at first glance seem to be unrelated, but we'll see that they actually are pieces of a puzzle. And when we put the puzzle together, everything falls into place. The first is a famous vertical of the Meshech Chochmah, which we've quoted in past years, regarding the Ramban's question, that Moshe Rabbeinu comes to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and says, how am I going to provide them meat? So HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, okay, appoint 70 judges, and I'm going to send the slav miraculously. Doesn't make any sense. If HaKadosh Baruch Hu was going to perform a miracle, Moshe doesn't need any help. Like, what did the 70 judges accomplish? So the Meshech Chochmah says an amazing pshat. This is as follows. The Gemara in Taina says that the Mon fell in the merit of Moshe Rabbeinu. Now what does that mean, that the Mon fell in the merit of Moshe Rabbeinu? What does it mean when we say that something happens in the merit of another person? Now the Meshech Chochmah doesn't bring this source, but there's a very famous interpretation from the Baal Shem. There's a Gemara which says about the great sage of Chanina ben Dosa that a bas koil used to emerge and would say, Kol ha'olam kulo nizayin b'shvil Chanina b'ni. The entire world is sustained in the merit of my son Chanina ben Dosa. In his generation, the entire world was sustained in his merit. So the Baal Shem, it's quoted in various svarim, commented on the word bishvil. Bishvil. So the normal translation bishvil is because. But the word shvil means a path, a channel. As kol ha'olam kulo nizayin bishvil Chanina b'ni means that the sustenance for the entire world goes through the channel of Chanina ben Dosa. Meaning that when HaKadosh Baruch Hu sends bracha, sends blessing to the world, it goes through a channel, through a pipeline. And that pipeline is the tzaddik hador, the tzaddik of the generation. In Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa's time, he was the channel. It was through him that the shefa, the flow of parnasa, came to the world. That's kol ha'olam kulo nizayin, the entire world is sustained, b'shvil Chanina b'ni, through the channel, through the pathway, through the pipeline of Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa. So the Meshul Chachma, not quoting that source, but expressing the same idea, says that if the shefa, if the flow of bracha is going to go through a tzaddik, it has to be on that tzaddik's terms. I mean, there are certain pipes that can carry certain substances, and certain pipes that can carry other substances. Because Moshe Rabbeinu was an Ish Elokim, he was a godly person. He could bring godly food to the world. He could bring mun to the world. The flow of mun could travel through the channel of Moshe Rabbeinu. Mun is a spiritual food. The Gemara calls it lechem abirim, lechem shemalachi ashara soichlim. It's a spiritual food. The angels eat mun. Moshe Rabbeinu could be the channel to bring mun to the world. But he couldn't be the channel to bring meat to the world. Meat is material, it's earthy, it's not lofty, it's not sublime. As Moshe Rabbeinu said, I can be the channel to bring mun to the world, but I can't be the channel to bring meat to the world. So imagine you go to a restaurant that's administered by one of the great French chefs, and you come and you have to order, and the menu is very, very fancy, finest French cuisine, everything is very, very top of the line, and really you're not used to that. You want simple food. So the chef comes out and you say, sir, I'm afraid I can't eat your fancy food, just make me a hot dog. So the French chef will say with indignation, I can't make a hot dog. He says, you want one of the classic dishes of French cuisine, that I can make. So a hot dog. I can't make a hot dog. Because Moshe Rabbeinu couldn't bring a hot dog into the world. He could bring man into the world. He couldn't bring basar into the world. And that's the pshat, says the Meshul Chachma. When Moshe Rabbeinu said, where do I have meat? It wasn't the practical consideration, where is he going to find meat? He's saying the shefa, the bracha of basar, cannot be transmitted through Moshe Rabbeinu. So to that, HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, you're right. You're taka right. So instead, we will appoint a new hierarchy of Nevi'im. We'll appoint 70 Nevi'im. Those 70 Nevi'im will not be like you. They won't be with their heads in Shamayim. They'll be down-to-earth people, regular people. They'll be Nevi'im. And through them, there can be a shefa of basar. That's the Meshul Chachma says. A beautiful, beautiful pshat to answer the Ramban's question. That's what the HaKadosh Baruch Hu was saying. If meat cannot be sent through the channel of Moshe Rabbeinu, but meat can be sent through the channel of the 70 Nevi'im. Very beautiful pshat. That is the first variable. That's the Meshul Chachma. The next variable, the next piece of the puzzle, is a very, very famous comment of the Netziv in the beginning of next week's parsha. There's a question, next week's parsha, the story of the Meraglim. The decision was made to send spies to scout out the land. The question is this correct or is this not correct? Because obviously, later on, there was a terrible sin. They came back with a negative report. The people lost faith in the Kadosh Baruch Hu. But was the sending of spies itself wrong? Rashi and many Midrashim take the position it was wrong. Why was it wrong? It was wrong because you don't trust God. God says Eretz Yisrael is a wonderful land. It's a land flowing with milk and honey. You don't trust Him. You don't believe Him. So sending spies to see for yourself is sinful. That's the position Rashi and the Midrashim take. The Ramban argues. The Ramban says if you read the parsha carefully, it doesn't say that the Meraglim were sent to see whether Eretz Yisrael is a beautiful land. The Meraglim were sent to reconnoiter the land for the purpose of conquest. To know where the strong points are, where the weak points are, where the entryways are. Of course, Eretz Yisrael is a land flowing with milk and honey. If you want to conquer the land, you have to have intelligence for the purpose of conquest. Says the Ramban, there's nothing wrong with that. Because Ein Seimchen Al Nes, you can't rely on a miracle. You have no right to rely on miracles. So therefore, there had to be military intelligence, and that's why the Meraglim were sent. So therefore, the Ramban says it only became a sin later, when the Meraglim came back with their report that Eretz Yisrael was unconquerable, and that was the lack of faith in God. That's when it became a sin. But the sending of Meraglim itself was not sinful. The Netziv cites the Ramban, and then the Netziv points out it doesn't make sense. Because according to Chazal say that if Moshe had not sent Meraglim, there would have been no need to conquer Eretz Yisrael militarily. The conquest of Eretz Yisrael would have been totally miraculous. So where does it start? The Ramban says that they were justified in sending Meraglim to know how to militarily conquer the land. Says in the Netziv, no, they only had to conquer the land militarily because they sent Meraglim. So why did they send Meraglim? So the Netziv says an amazing pshat. The Netziv says like this, that there are two ways in which HaKadosh Baruch Hu runs the world. There is a miraculous hanhaga above the natural order. Then there is the natural way. Until this point in the Bamidbar, the Jews were being led in a supernatural way. They were being fed the man, which was miraculous. They were being fed the bear of Miriam. They'd experienced 10 plagues in Mitzrayim, the splitting of the Red Sea. The entire way in which the Jews were led was miraculous. And if things would have continued, the conquest of Eretz Yisrael would have been miraculous. But when HaKadosh Baruch Hu provides miracles for us, there is more that is expected of us. The more we receive from God, the more we are beholden to Him. And the Jews noticed a terribly frightening thing, that they were being held liable for very, very seemingly small sins. The Pasuk says that people began to complain about the weariness of travel. All of a sudden a fire broke out and began to consume people at the edge of the camp. They complained that they want meat, and they were given meat that led to their deaths. There's another story mentioned in the parsha, that Miriam spoke Lashon Hara. She slandered her brother Moshe Rabbeinu. She was stricken with tzarats. So they said, this is unbearable. Because the HaKadosh Baruch Hu is leading us in this supernatural way, He's making demands of us that we can't meet. So the Jews said, we don't want that anymore. We want to live regular, simple, mundane lives. We don't want to live in that high spiritual plane where God makes so many demands of us. We can't live that way. He says we want things to be simple, mundane, natural. How do you force God's hand? Well, we know there's an idea that God relates to us the way we relate to Him. So the Jews had a scheme. The scheme was, if we decide that we want the conquest of Eretz Yisrael to be natural, and therefore we will send Meraglim, we will send spies to provide us military intelligence, it will become a self-fulfilling prophecy. God will say, well, that's what they want, that's what they want, that's what they get. You asked for it. and says the Netziv Kachab, that was the case. What Chazal say is true. Had they not sent Meraglim, the conquest of Eretz Yisrael would have been supernatural. But because they sent Meraglim and they declared that they don't want to live in that higher spiritual plane, that's why everything was reduced, and at that point, sending the Meraglim was in fact a military necessity. The sending of the Meraglim made it necessary. Of course, they could have come back with a positive report, and then they would have gone into Eretz Yisrael, albeit with arms and military tactics. As a result of the subsequent sin, accepting the negative report, they were condemned to wander in the Bamidbar 40 years. That is the amazing interpretation of the Netziv. That's the second piece of the puzzle. What the connection is not apparent yet. Now I want to share with you a third piece of the puzzle, which is a very famous comment of the Arachayim in Parshas Devarim. In Parshas Devarim, there is a very, very perplexing pasuk. There, Moshe Rabbeinu recounts the story of the Meraglim. And he tells the whole story in great detail. And after he finishes telling the story of the Meraglim, this is the end of the first chapter of Devarim, it says, Gam bi Gam bi his anaf Hashem biglalchem. That God was also angry at me because of you. And he said, you cannot go into Eretz Yisrael. So the pasuk clearly seems to imply that somehow Moshe Rabbeinu, his not being able to go into Eretz Yisrael was somehow also related to the Chet HaMeraglim. So the Ramban asks in that pasuk, and it's not true. The Meraglim took place in the second year after the Yetzias Mitzrayim. Moshe Rabbeinu's hitting the rack took place in the last year, before the entry into Eretz Yisrael, 38 years later. Because how could Moshe Rabbeinu put it this way, that as a consequence of the Chet HaMeraglim, I was prohibited to go into Eretz Yisrael? This is a question which the Arachayim asks. The Ramban asks. And the Arachayim gives an amazing answer. It's a little bit of a clever answer, almost too clever. It says like this. There's a famous medrash which brings the pasuk. It says Mizmor liYosef. That Asaf, one of the authors of Tehillim, composed a song. Mizmor liYosef, a song. It says Elokim bo goyim v'nachlasecha. The Gentiles have entered your land. They've entered the Beis HaMikdash, they've destroyed the Beis HaMikdash. So the Medrash asks the question, it's a Medrash Rabbanecha, that Mizmor liYosef, this is a song of Asaf. It should be a kina, it should be a lament, a dirge. Why is it a song? So the Medrash gives a mashal, that there was once a man who had a son, and the son was to be married. And the father built a beautiful hall for the wedding, a beautiful chuppah, and a beautiful meal. And then the son did something wrong, something terribly wrong. So the father destroyed the chuppah, and he destroyed the house, and he destroyed the entire su'udah. Now the son had a tutor, his teacher, and the tutor took out his flute and started playing a song. A joyous song. So the father says to him, what are you playing a joyous song? What are you so happy about? He says, my son did this terrible thing, and I destroyed the chuppah, I destroyed the palace, I destroyed the su'udah. What are you playing music for? So the tutor says a very clever answer. He says, I'm very happy because you could have taken it out on your son. Because instead of beating your son to a pulp, you destroyed the chuppah, you destroyed the meal, you destroyed the palace. So I'm very happy. That's a cause for rejoicing. That's why the tutor, the son's tutor, who apparently loved the son very much, began to play this joyous song. So the Medrash says that's the idea of Mizmor liYosef. Says, you see, when the Rebbeinu Shalom destroyed the Beis HaMikdash, when he brought about the Churban Beis HaMikdash, it really means that the Jewish people were deserving of destruction. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu poured out his anger on Eitzim v'Avonim, on the wooden stones of the Beis HaMikdash. So if it's a cause for song, HaKadosh Baruch Hu could have taken it out on the Jewish people. And instead HaKadosh Baruch Hu took it out on a building, a wooden stone. So that's Mizmor Liyasa, that's a song. That's what the Medrash says. So what do we see from this Medrash? We see from the Medrash that when there's supposed to be a Churban, really it shows that the Jewish people should have been deserving of destruction. And the Midas Hadin was vented on the building of the Beis HaMikdash. That's what Chazal say. Now, when was the Churban Beis HaMikdash decreed? So Chazal tell us, for reasons that we won't go into now, that the Churban Beis HaMikdash was decreed when the Jews committed the sin of the Meraglim. When the Jews committed the sin of the Meraglim and they cried that night, which was Tisha B'Av, so Hashem said, Atem b'chisem b'chia shalchinam, you cried for nothing. I'll give you something to cry about. I will make this day a time of b'chia l'doros, a b'chia for all eternity. And that's why the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. What that really means is that as a consequence of the Chet HaMeraglim, really Klal Yisrael should have been destroyed. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu vented his anger on the Eitzim and Avonim of the Beis HaMikdash. Now, goes Darchei a step further. And Darchei says that really, if Moshe Rabbeinu would have gone into Eretz Yisrael, we know that everything Moshe Rabbeinu did had a permanence. You may remember, we've spoken out many times, the Sforno, at the beginning of Parshas Pekudei, who says this. He points out that the Gemara in Sukkah says that although the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, the Mishkan was never destroyed. The Krushim of the Mishkan are Atei Shitim Eindim, they stand forever. The Mishkan was replaced by the Beis HaMikdash, but it was never destroyed. So the Sforno says, why was that? So the Sforno says, because the Beis HaMikdash was built by a lesser person, by Shlomo HaMelech. The Mishkan was built by Moshe Rabbeinu. Everything Moshe Rabbeinu did had a permanence. So let's say Moshe Rabbeinu would have gone into Eretz Yisrael and he would have built the Beis HaMikdash. The Beis HaMikdash would have been permanent. Well, if the Beis HaMikdash would have been permanent and God could not pour his anger on the Eitzim and Avonim of the Beis HaMikdash, what would the result have been? Klal Yisrael would have been destroyed. So it says the Orach Chaim, a very clever cheshbon, that when HaKadosh Baruch Hu decreed as a consequence of the Chet HaMeraglim that there would be a Churban Beis HaMikdash, at the same time he had to decree that Moshe Rabbeinu would not go into Eretz Yisrael. It says why? Because if Moshe would go into Eretz Yisrael, he'd build the Beis HaMikdash that couldn't be destroyed, and then the anger would have to be poured out on the Jewish people, and the Jewish people would be destroyed. So therefore, says the Darchei, this amazing cheshbon, that really Moshe Rabbeinu's not being able to go into Eretz Yisrael was a consequence of the Chet HaMeraglim. So the question is, the Torah says not like that. The Torah says it was a consequence of the sin of the main Meriva. So the Darchei says a very simple answer. He says no. If Moshe Rabbeinu would have sanctified God's name at the main Meriva by hitting the rock, by speaking to the rock rather, that would have been a tikkun, that would have prepared the sin of the Meraglim. Then the Gzeir of the Churban would have been annulled, and then Moshe could have gone into Eretz Yisrael. So instead, Moshe Rabbeinu failed, therefore the sin of the Meraglim was not rectified, therefore there was a Gzeir of the Churban, therefore Moshe Rabbeinu couldn't go into Eretz Yisrael. But in reality, it's all a consequence of the sin of the Meraglim. Now this is very clever, almost seems a little too clever. But I think that if we remind ourselves of what the Netziv said, we can actually argue on what the Darchei said. And as when we talk about Moshe Rabbeinu's acts having permanence, that Moshe Rabbeinu, whatever he did was permanent. Whatever lesser people do has no permanence. How do we understand that? Why should that be? And I think the answer is like this. Things that are natural degenerate. Things that are natural degenerate. You know, I think if you speak to any physicist, they'll tell you there's a natural process of entropy where everything tends to decay and to disintegrate, to become disordered. Even the universe itself, at a very slow rate, is decaying and decomposing, breaking down. Things that are natural don't have permanence. Things that are miraculous have permanence. There's Moshe Rabbeinu, because everything he did was on a higher plane. It was l'mala miderech hateva. That's why his works had permanence. But if a lesser person does something, so he only works within the framework of teva, that's why his things are not permanent. They decay, they break down, they can be destroyed. Now let's remind ourselves that the initial conquest of Eretz Yisrael was meant to be miraculous, as the Netziv says. But the Jews rejected that. The Jews wanted it to be a natural process. So we could say that even if Moshe Rabbeinu had gone into Eretz Yisrael, the Beis HaMikdash that he would have built could have been destroyed. Could have been destroyed. Because once the Jews established, by sending the Meraglim, that we want our entry to Eretz Yisrael to be natural, then nothing would have permanence, even if it would have been done by Moshe Rabbeinu. So the Orach Chaim's interpretation can be questioned. But I think that if we put the pieces to the puzzle together, we'll be able to understand the entire parasha in a different light. The issue really is this. There's a question. The Jews are going into Eretz Yisrael. Should the conquest of Eretz Yisrael be supernatural? Or should it be natural? Should it be l'mala min hateva, above and beyond the laws of nature? Should it be consistent with nature? The Jews made a conscious choice. The Jews' conscious choice was not to reject Moshe Rabbeinu. What they were saying is as follows, that why should Moshe Rabbeinu lead us in a supernatural way? Let Moshe Rabbeinu lead us in a natural way. But they weren't rejecting Moshe Rabbeinu. They were making a choice about the way they want to conquer Eretz Yisrael. As far as they're concerned, they have no problem Moshe Rabbeinu should be the leader. Just that Moshe Rabbeinu, instead of leading us in the way which is l'mala miderech hateva, let him lead us in the way which is b'derech hateva. Simple as that. The question was, are they asking Moshe Rabbeinu to do something that he can't do? If I would ask you to do something which is totally inconsistent with your personality, with your nature, can you do it? Well, some people may be very flexible. This is what I would do normally, but if you ask me to do the opposite, I can do that. Right? The French chef may be able to make a hot dog. I don't know. Maybe he can. But now, the story of the basar has a very, very deep connection to the story of the Meraglim, which we would never have noticed. In other words, when Moshe Rabbeinu was given this challenge, until now Moshe Rabbeinu has been the channel through which we've been given mon, the supernatural food. And now he's called upon to be the channel through which we will receive basar. So Moshe Rabbeinu demonstrated an inability to adapt. I cannot do that. I can only do what I can do. I can't do something which is contrary to my nature. I can bring mon into the world. I can bring the supernatural food into the world. I can't bring hot dogs into the world. I can't bring meat into the world. There's a limit. Because as great as Moshe Rabbeinu was, he said, I can't do something which is contrary to my nature, to my essence. I can bring mon. Because I'm a person who lives on a higher spiritual plane. I can bring this godly food, this food that the angels eat. I can't bring steak. I can't bring hamburger. I can't bring hot dogs into the world. I can't do that. That I cannot be the shvil. I cannot be the pathway to which this happens. As a consequence, when the Jews decided that they wanted the conquest of Eretz Yisrael to be natural, they were rejecting Moshe Rabbeinu, because it couldn't be Moshe Rabbeinu. If Moshe Rabbeinu could bring meat, he could also bring the conquest of Eretz Yisrael in a natural way. But a Moshe Rabbeinu who can only bring mon and not meat, a Moshe Rabbeinu who only can be the channel for things that are supernatural, not for things that are natural, he cannot be the leader that would lead the Jews into Eretz Yisrael if the conquest had to be natural. And therefore, it was unintended. But when the Jews made that fateful decision that they're not going to go into Eretz Yisrael with miracles, they're going to go into Eretz Yisrael with arms, they were also making another decision that it could not be Moshe Rabbeinu that would lead them, it would have to be Yeshua that would lead them. And that's why the story, the prophecy of Eldad Unedad, is very, very intimately connected to the question of who will the leader in Eretz Yisrael be. That when they had this story, that the Jews asked for meat, and Moshe Rabbeinu said, I can't give meat, and instead it have to be 70 Iskenim, and the 70 Iskenim were going to be the channel for meat. So Eldad Unedad understood, right? If this in fact is the case, if Moshe Rabbeinu cannot be the shvil, cannot be the pathway through which meat is given to the world, if it has to be that meat is given through the 70, then Moshe Rabbeinu cannot be the leader of the Jews into Eretz Yisrael. Now, of course, it was a consequence of a later event. It was a consequence of the fact that the Jews made that conscious decision that the conquest of Eretz Yisrael should be natural rather than supernatural, but that would not itself have had an effect if not for the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu demonstrated that he could not bring meat into the world. If Moshe Rabbeinu could have brought meat, if Moshe Rabbeinu had that ability to function on two levels, I can function on the supernatural level and on the natural level, then as well, when the Jews made a decision that the conquest of Eretz Yisrael should be natural, okay, it can be supernatural through Moshe, it can be natural through Moshe. But when Moshe Rabbeinu said, I can't bring meat, I only can bring man, so then the subsequent decision of the Jews that the conquest of Eretz Yisrael should be natural rather than supernatural meant it would have to be Yeshua rather than Moshe. And that's why the prophecy of Eldad Unedad, of Moshe Meitz for Yeshua Machnes, is closely bound to the story of the mon and the meat. So it comes out that it's true that Moshe Rabbeinu is not going into Eretz Yisrael is a consequence of the Chet HaMeraglim. It's a consequence of the Chet HaMeraglim. It's also a consequence of Moshe's inability to bring meat. But it's a consequence of the Chet HaMeraglim, not the Chet of the report of the Meraglim, but the Chet of the sending of Meraglim. Because the Jews sent Meraglim, and therefore opted for the natural conquest of Eretz Yisrael, Moshe couldn't be their leader. But, and this is a big but that generation ended up not going into Eretz Yisrael anyway. Because that generation that opted to send the Meraglim also opted to accept the negative report of the Meraglim, and therefore was decreed they should be died in the Bamidbar. Only the next generation will go into Eretz Yisrael. And now there's a very serious question. That next generation, how would they go into Eretz Yisrael? Would they go into Eretz Yisrael in a supernatural way? Or would they go into Eretz Yisrael in a natural way? Was that determined? Was that decided? You see, if it was a consequence of the choice that the senders of the Meraglim made, perhaps that's a choice that would have affected only their generation. Maybe the next generation would go back to square one, and maybe they could go into Eretz Yisrael miraculously. Or maybe this was a choice that would have consequences for all eternity. That's a good question. In other words, when does a choice have an eternal consequence? Or when does a choice have only a consequence for the person making the choice? Because we know certain choices only affect the person making the choice. If I do an aveira and I get a punishment, it's only me who's punished. Right? Bonim lo yumsu alavos. Children aren't punished for their parents' aveiras. Sometimes, however, there are choices that parents make that affect all eternity. Adam Rishon and Chava and Gan Eden made a choice, and the consequences of that choice we suffer on a yom hazeh. So this isn't a clear thing. Because if the fact that Eretz Yisrael was going to be conquered naturally, not supernaturally, was a consequence of the sin of sending Meraglim, maybe it was only for that generation. But the next generation, the generation that came to maturity in the Bamidbar, perhaps they would revert back to square one. They would go into Eretz Yisrael in a supernatural way, and therefore Moshe Rabbeinu could be their leader. It wasn't the Clark. And therefore I believe that Moshe Rabbeinu, when he prayed, may have been praying to go in as a leader. Not as the Mitzvah said. Because Moshe Rabbeinu said, of course, I couldn't go in for the previous generation, because then the conquest would have to have been natural. That I can't do. But maybe for this generation it could be supernatural. And therefore Moshe Rabbeinu held that the Nevuah of Eldad Umeidad was irrelevant. The Nevuah of Eldad Umeidad was only for that generation. That generation that sent the Meraglim. So therefore they determined that the conquest of Eretz Yisrael would be natural. It's going to be natural. It has to be Moshe Meis V'Yoshua Machnes. But the next generation, which was not implicated in the sin of sending Meraglim, perhaps for them it could have been natural. And therefore Moshe Rabbeinu hoped that he could go into Eretz Yisrael, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu told him no. Because of your own personal sin, you can't go. Because you're right. It's not because of the sin of the Meraglim anymore. It's not because of the sin of the Meraglim anymore. The sin of the Meraglim would not have been a factor for the next generation. It says, but you can't go into Eretz Yisrael because of the sin of the main Meriva. And that's why you can't go in. So, it's both are true. To address the Darchei's point, that if the generation that sent the Meraglim would have been allowed to go into Eretz Yisrael, then Moshe Rabbeinu would not have been allowed to go in because of the Chet HaMeraglim. But because it was the next generation that went in, therefore Moshe Rabbeinu was only forbidden because of the Chet of the Mei Meriva. If the reason is because of the Chet of the Mei Meriva, so that's his personal shortcoming. But maybe the entry there, so it would still be miraculous. And therefore it wouldn't have to be through Yoshua. It could be through someone who could carry on Moshe Rabbeinu's own work, which would be his own children. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu told him no. It has to be Yoshua. Meaning that the Nevuah of Eldad Umeidad is still operative. Because this decision that was made by the descendants of the Meraglim did not only affect that generation, it affected all future generations. The conquest of Eretz Yisrael would always have to be natural, and therefore the Nevuah of Eldad Umeidad was still operative, of Moshe, Meis, and Yeshua, Machnes. But at least we understand Moshe's happening, and it wouldn't be the case. Because Moshe Rabbeinu thought that perhaps the Nevuah of Eldad Umeidad wasn't relevant anymore. It was only relevant to that generation, not to the next generation. HaKadosh Baruch Hu told him no, and that's why Yeshua was appointed and not Moshe Rabbeinu. So this, I think, pieces all the elements of the puzzle together. But the thing that we have to take out of this, I think in terms of a musar, is that the pasuk says, Hashem tzilcha. Hashem is your shadow. So the Medrash says, just like a shadow follows a person around, so HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the way he relates to us is the way we relate to him. Now the question of how HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to relate to us really depends very much on how we want to relate to him. They wanted a natural relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, a relationship in which Teva mediates between God and us. It became a self-fulfilling prophecy. L'may nafkamina for us. Now, one of the great questions that we grapple with in life is the question of theodicy, the question of how to understand suffering in the world. And what makes the problem particularly perplexing is because when we study Chazal, we find that the hanhag of the Rebbeinu Shalom in running the world is always mida k'neged mida, measure for measure. There's supposed to be a beautiful congruence between what we do and what happens to us. to the extent that if we do an Aveira, the punishment is fine-tuned exactly to match the Aveira, to the extent that the punishment can be instructive. If this happens to me, I can figure out, oh, why did this happen to me? Mostly I did that Aveira that corresponds to this punishment. Now I know what to do, I know how to do tshuva, and it's very beautiful. Hanhag of Mida Keneged Mida, life itself would be very instructive. Everything that would happen to me would give me guidance and instruction as how to improve my life and how to be better. It would be a perfect life. And instead, we live in a world where everything seems to be random, haphazard. There's no connection to what happens to me and what I may have done. There's no linkage, there's no understanding. We suffer calamities, we are not inspired or guided in any meaningful way. Why is that? Why is that? I want to point out that in reality, the Mida Keneged Mida, the measure for measure, is very precise even B'zman Hazeh. The HaKadosh Baruch Hu relates to us the way we relate to Him. He says, if we would want to live a life in which HaKadosh Baruch Hu was engaged with us, we would have an easier time seeing how HaKadosh Baruch Hu relates to us. But if we live a life in which HaKadosh Baruch Hu is noticeably absent, where we are not interested in His being engaged, so the Rebbeinu Shalom as well sits back and says, listen, says, if you prefer to live in a world which appears to be random, so you can live in a world which appears to be random. That's the measure for measure. The measure for measure is, if you don't want God to be involved in your world, you don't want to live a life which is an actual give and take with the Rebbeinu Shalom, so the Baruch says, so be it. You'll live in a world which appears random, it appears haphazard, it appears that there is no rhyme or reason to whatever happens. That itself is the Mida Keneged Mida. That itself is the measure for measure. You know, the Chavetz Chaim was once asked a question. A person came to the Chavetz Chaim and asked, why is it that there are no Nisim Gluyim B'zman Hazeh? Why are there no revealed miracles B'zman Hazeh? And the Chavetz Chaim said, I don't understand, could you repeat the question? He says, why are there no revealed miracles B'zman Hazeh? So the Chavetz Chaim, I don't understand, what are you talking about? Can you repeat the question? He says, there are no miracles. He says, what do you mean there are no miracles? The Chavetz Chaim said, the world is filled with miracles. Every day there are miracles. We see miracles. What's the pshat? The pshat is that if you want to see miracles, you'll see miracles. If you don't want to see miracles, then everything is just natural and consistent with unbending laws of nature. But the way we relate to God determines how God relates to us. Right? That is a lesson which emerges from this analysis of the story. If we want to live in a world where God is a reality, where God is a presence, where God is engaged with us, we have to be open to seeing the world that way. If we don't want to see the world that way, the world won't appear that way. To the Chavetz Chaim, the world appeared that way. He lived in a world where God was a presence, He was involved, He was guiding the course of history, He was guiding the fate of individuals, because that's how the Chavetz Chaim chose to see the world. And those of us who are not quite on that level and choose to see the world differently and will be more comfortable in a world which is fixed and orderly and conforms to unbending laws of nature, so that's how the world will appear to us. Hashem Tzilcha, because Baruch was our shadow. The story of the Meraglim is one illustration of it. I think it's a principle which is really relevant even B'zman Hazeh.